The world felt like it was collapsing under Jake's feet. Each step a rebellion against the chaos he'd left behind in Denver. His boyfriend of 3 years, Mark, had packed his bags and walked out, leaving nothing but a note that read, "I can't do this anymore." Now, alone on a winding trail in the Colorado Rockies, Jake's heart pounded not from the climb, but from the ache of betrayal. He'd come here to escape, to let the mountains swallow his pain. The air was crisp, scented with pine and earth, and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the trail. Jake, 28, with a lean frame honed from years of hiking, adjusted his backpack and pushed forward, his green eyes scanning the horizon for something, anything, to distract him from the void Mark had left. As he rounded a bend, the sound of hooves broke the silence. Jake froze, his breath catching as a horse emerged from the trees, its rider a vision straight out of a Western film. The man, maybe 30, sat tall in the saddle, his leather jacket hugging broad shoulders and his Stetson casting a shadow over sharp, handsome features. His hazel eyes locked onto Jake's, and a slow, easy smile spread across his face, disarming and dangerous all at once. "Lost. City boy," the cowboy called, his voice a warm drawl that sent a shiver down Jake's spine. Jake managed a half-laugh, brushing a hand through his tousled brown hair. "Just clearing my head," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. The cowboy swung down from his horse with a grace that made Jake's pulse quicken. "Name's Ethan," he said, extending a hand. "You look like you could use a guide." Jake hesitated, then shook Ethan's hand, feeling the callous strength in his grip. There was something about Ethan, something magnetic, unguarded, that made Jake's carefully built walls tremble. He didn't know it yet, but this chance encounter was about to unravel everything he thought he knew about himself. The trail stretched on, and Ethan insisted on walking beside Jake, his horse trailing behind. They talked easily, the conversation flowing like the mountain stream they passed. Ethan was a rancher, born and raised in a small town an hour from here. He spoke of the land with a reverence that made Jake, a graphic designer who spent most days staring at a screen, feel like he'd been missing something vital. "You ever ridden?" Ethan asked, nodding toward his horse, a sleek chestnut mare named Juniper. Jake shook his head. "City kid. Closest I've gotten is a carousel." Ethan chuckled, the sound low and warm. "We'll fix that." Before Jake could protest, Ethan was guiding him toward Juniper, his hand steady as he showed Jake how to mount. Their fingers brushed, and Jake's heart stuttered. He told himself it was the altitude, but the way Ethan's eyes lingered told a different story. As they continued, the trail opened to a clearing with a view that stole Jake's breath, peaks rolling into the distance, kissed by the fading light. Ethan stopped, tying Juniper to a tree, and gestured for Jake to sit on a flat rock. They shared a silence that felt heavier than words, the kind that carried secrets. "You're running from something," Ethan said finally, his tone gentle but direct. "In my business, but I know that look." Jake's throat tightened. He hadn't planned to spill his heart to a stranger, but something about Ethan's steady presence pulled the truth out. "My boyfriend left me," he admitted, the words raw. 3 years, and he just walked away. Ethan didn't flinch. "That's a hell of a thing," he said softly. "But you're here, still standing. That's more than most can say." Jake looked at him, really looked, and saw something in Ethan's eyes, pain, maybe, or understanding. It was enough to make Jake wonder what scars Ethan carried beneath that cowboy charm. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan offered to camp nearby, suggesting Jake join him rather than hike back in the dark. Against his better judgment, Jake agreed. They set up a small fire, the crackle of wood mingling with the night's chill. Ethan shared stories of his life on the ranch, of losing his brother to a car accident years ago, of learning to find peace in the open land. Jake, in turn, spoke of his dreams, his fears, and the hollow ache Mark had left behind. When Ethan reached for Jake's hand, it wasn't a question, but a quiet certainty. Their fingers laced together, and Jake felt a spark that both terrified and thrilled him. He didn't pull away. The firelight danced across Ethan's face, carving shadows that made his features even more striking. Jake couldn't look away, caught in the gravity of the moment. He'd spent years building a life with Mark, only to watch it crumble. And now here he was, holding hands with a cowboy under a sky so vast it felt like it could swallow his pain whole. "You ever feel like you're meant for something bigger?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Like the life you're living ain't the one you were born for?" Jake nodded, his chest tight. "All the time. I thought Mark was my bigger. Now I don't know what I'm chasing." Ethan's thumb traced slow circles over Jake's knuckles, a gesture so tender it made Jake's breath hitch. "Maybe you're not supposed to chase," Ethan said. "Maybe you're supposed to just be." They sat like that for hours, the fire burning low, their conversation weaving through dreams and regrets. Ethan spoke of his own struggles, growing up gay in a small, conservative town, hiding who he was until he couldn't anymore. "Left home at 18, he said, his eyes distant. Folks didn't take kindly to the truth. Been on my own since." Jake's heart ached for him. "Do you ever go back?" Ethan shook his head. "Some bridges you don't rebuild. But I found my place out here." The land don't judge. As the night deepened, Ethan offered Jake his sleeping bag, insisting he be fine with a blanket. Jake protested, but Ethan's stubborn grin won out. They lay side by side under the stars, the cold seeping through Jake's layers but not touching the warmth he felt from Ethan's presence. Morning came too soon, the sky blushing pink as Ethan stirred, his hair mussed and his smile sleepy. "You snore," he teased, nudging Jake's shoulder. "Liar," Jake shot back, but he was grinning, something he hadn't done in days. They packed up, and Ethan offered to ride with Jake back to the trailhead. This time, when Ethan helped Jake on a juniper, his hands lingered on Jake's waist, steady and sure. The ride was quiet, the rhythm of Juniper's steps a soothing counterpoint to Jake's racing thoughts. He wasn't ready to say goodbye, not to Ethan, not to this feeling. When they reached the trailhead, Ethan dismounted and stood close, his gaze searching. "You got a phone?" Ethan asked, pulling out an old flip phone that made Jake laugh. They exchanged numbers, and Ethan's fingers brushed Jake's again, deliberate this time. "Come back to the ranch sometime," he said. "I'll teach you to ride proper." Jake drove back to Denver with Ethan's number burning a hole in his pocket. He didn't know what this was, friendship, flirtation, or something more, but for the first time in weeks, he felt alive. Back in Denver, Jake's apartment felt like a cage. The walls, once filled with memories of Mark, now mocked him with their emptiness. He threw himself into work, designing logos for clients who didn't care about his heartbreak. But Ethan's voice lingered in his mind, that warm drawl pulling him back to the mountains. A week later, Jake texted Ethan, half expecting no reply. When his phone buzzed with, "Ranch is waiting." "You in?" Jake's heart leapt. He didn't overthink it. He packed a bag and drove to the address Ethan sent, a sprawling ranch nestled in a valley 2 hours from the city. Ethan greeted him in the same leather jacket, his smile brighter than the midday sun. The ranch was alive with activity, horses grazing, ranch hands calling to each other, the air thick with the scent of hay and leather. Ethan gave Jake a tour, his pride in the place infectious. "Built this from nothing," he said, gesturing to the barns and fields. "It's home." That evening, Ethan took Jake to a local bar, a dive with neon signs and a jukebox playing old country tunes. They drank beer, laughed, and danced, Ethan pulling Jake onto the floor with a confidence that made Jake's cheeks flush. The other patrons didn't bat an eye, and for the first time, Jake felt free to be himself. No masks needed. But the night wasn't all ease. A group of rough-looking men at the bar stared, their whispers sharp with judgment. Ethan noticed and squeezed Jake's hand under the table. "Ignore 'em," he murmured. "They ain't worth your time." Jake tried, but the tension followed them outside. As they walked to Ethan's truck, one of the men followed, his voice slurring with venom. "You two think you can just flaunt that around here?" Ethan stepped in front of Jake, his jaw tight. "Go home, Carl," he said, his voice low but firm. "This ain't your business." Carl sneered but backed off, muttering slurs under his breath. Jake's hand shook as they drove back to the ranch, the encounter a stark reminder of the world's cruelty. Ethan reached for his hand, his touch grounding. "I'm sorry," he said. Some folks never change. At the ranch, they sat on the porch, the night air cool against Jake's skin. Ethan's vulnerability cracked open, and he admitted how much those moments hurt, even after years of facing them. Jake leaned closer, their shoulders brushing, and whispered, "You make it easier to be brave." The days at the ranch blurred into a rhythm Jake hadn't known he needed. He learned to ride, Ethan's patient hands guiding him, their laughter echoing across the fields. They cooked together, shared stories, and stole moments of closeness, a brush of hands, a lingering glance. Jake felt himself falling, not just for Ethan, but for the life he represented. Raw, honest, unapologetic. But doubt crept in. Jake's life was in Denver, his job, his friends, the world he'd built. Ethan's world was here, rooted in the land. Could they bridge that gap? Jake pushed the question aside, focusing on the present, on Ethan's smile as they rode side by side, the wind in their hair. One evening, as they watched the sunset from a hill overlooking the ranch, Ethan turned to Jake, his expression serious. "I need to tell you something," he said. "I've been running from my past, too. There's a reason I don't go home." Ethan confessed that, after coming out, his family had disowned him. His father, a pastor, had called him an abomination. The pain in Ethan's voice cut Jake deep, and he reached for Ethan, pulling him into a hug. "You're not what they said you are," Jake whispered. "You're everything." Ethan kissed him then, slow and deliberate, under the fading light. It was Jake's first kiss since Mark, and it felt like waking up, But the moment was shattered by the sound of tires on gravel. A truck pulled up, and a man who looked like an older version of Ethan stepped out. His father. "Caleb." "What the hell is this?" Caleb demanded, his eyes blazing as he saw them together. Ethan stood, his body rigid, but Jake felt the tremor in his hand. "Dad, you need to leave," Ethan said, his voice steady but laced with pain. Caleb's tirade was merciless, his words a barrage of hate that left Jake reeling. Ethan held his ground, but Jake saw the cracks in his armor, the boy who'd been broken by rejection. When Caleb finally left, Ethan collapsed onto the grass, his breath ragged. Jake knelt beside him, his heart breaking. "I'm here," he said, holding Ethan's face. "I'm not going anywhere." The confrontation with Caleb left Ethan shaken, but it also brought him and Jake closer. They spent the next days rebuilding, their bond deepening with every shared moment. Jake helped with chores, his city hands learning the rhythm of the ranch, while Ethan opened up about his dreams of expanding the place, of making it a sanctuary for others like them. But Jake couldn't ignore the pull of Denver. His boss was pressuring him to return, and his lease was up soon. One night, as they lay in Ethan's bed, Jake voiced his fears. "What happens when I go back? Can this us work?" Ethan's eyes softened. "I don't know, Jake, but I know I want to try." The next morning, Ethan surprised Jake with a plan, a weekend trip to Denver, to see if he could fit into Jake's world. They drove into the city. Ethan's Cowboy hat drawing stares, but he navigated it with the same confidence he had on the ranch. Jake showed him his favorite coffee shop, his art studio, the places that defined him. Ethan listened, asked questions, and held Jake's hand in public, unafraid. But the trip wasn't without tension. At a gallery opening Jake had to attend, an old friend of Mark's, Liam, cornered him. "Heard you're slumming it with a cowboy," Liam sneered, his words dripping with condescension. Jake's temper flared, but Ethan stepped in, calm but firm. "Jake's not slumming," he said. "He's living." Liam backed off, but the encounter left Jake rattled. He realized how much he'd let others define him, Mark, Liam, even himself. With Ethan, he felt seen, not judged. That night, back at Jake's apartment, they made love for the first time, a collision of need and trust that left Jake breathless. As Ethan slept beside him, Jake stared at the ceiling, wrestling with a choice: stay in Denver or take a chance on the ranch. On Ethan, on a life he'd never imagined. Jake stood at a crossroads, his heart torn between two worlds. Denver was safe, familiar, but it felt like a shadow of the life he could have with Ethan. The ranch offered freedom, love, but also uncertainty. He spent days agonizing, talking it through with Ethan, who never pushed, but simply said, "I want you happy, Jake." Wherever that is. In the end, Jake made his choice. He quit his job, sublet his apartment, and moved to the ranch. It wasn't easy, learning to live in a new world, facing the occasional hostility of a small town, but Ethan was his anchor. They built a life together, turning the ranch into a haven for others who'd been cast out, a place where love was celebrated, not judged. One evening, a year later, Jake and Ethan sat on the same hill where Caleb had confronted them. The ranch was thriving, alive with new faces, young people, queer couples, all finding refuge. Ethan took Jake's hand, slipping a simple silver ring onto his finger. "I don't have much," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I've got you. Marry me." Jake's eyes filled with tears as he nodded, pulling Ethan into a kiss that felt like a promise. They'd faced hate, doubt, and their own fears, but they'd chosen each other. The mountain stood witness, silent and eternal, as Jake realized he hadn't just found love, he'd found home. Their story wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, a testament to the courage it took to love in a world that didn't always understand. And as the stars emerged, Jake knew he'd never hike alone again.